The supply chain for batteries is filled with human rights abuses, filled with corruption, and filled with environmental degradation. Congo is incredibly wealthy in terms of raw minerals, but it remains one of the poorest places on earth. You see technology driving quite a lot of the exploitation in the DRC, the same cycles of violence, the same cycles of impoverishment, the same cycles of corruption.
This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. And this episode is one of our Think Twice conversations where instead of a debate, I talk with one person who brings so much insight to a topic that you will forever find yourself thinking about that thing twice, that thing that we are discussing, which of course is the same effect as a good debate, but there's just no arguing. Instead, conversation. Now, to set the table on this one, there's a certain kind of book that I really enjoy reading where the author frames a very concrete and specific subject and then finds endless connections to other subjects, all threads of a very complex story. Franklin Foer of The Atlantic did this with his book, How Soccer Explains the World. Another good one is Mark Pendergast's Uncommon Grounds, The History of Coffee and How It Transformed Our World. Alan Gurney did a brilliant book about the compass and how it changed everything. I took the same approach when I wrote my own book. I don't know if you know, I'm not just a debate moderator, but also an author. I wrote in a different key, The Story of Autism, which looks at the autism diagnosis and its discovery, but spins dozens of stories that go all over the world through places like courtrooms and scientific laboratories and civil rights battles, and there are heroes and villains and so on. So you get the idea. This episode is inspired by a book like that I just read, and it is fantastic. It's called Elements of Power, a story of war, technology, and the dirtiest supply chain on Earth. And its author, Nicolas Niarchos, is my guest. Nicolas, thank you so much for joining us on Open to Debate and one of our Think Twice episodes. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And what I want to propose as a premise for this program, and I want to see if you agree, is that the one thing that people will think twice about in their lives after hearing this conversation is that little object that so many of us carry everywhere with us and touch hundreds of times a day and stare at for minutes or even hours. And that thing is the not so humble mobile phone. I'm arguing that this conversation is going to make people think twice about that phone after they hear what you have to tell them. Do you think that's a fair thesis?
Yes, I mean, if they haven't read into this subject before, yes.
So let's get into the subject and just in the broadest sense, tell us the thesis of your book.
So the thesis of the book is that the supply chain for batteries is incredibly dirty, filled with human rights abuses, filled with corruption, and filled with environmental degradation, pollution. And we often think of these things as futuristic, green, and so on. But they actually rely on some very, very unpleasant realities and some very some very old truths. And what I would say as well is that the book is not an indictment of cell phones or of electric cars, but rather a look at how the supply chain is incredibly, has these problems, and then sort of looks also at some examples of things that have been done that are less problematic. So I can go on about this, but I'm sure you have another question.
All right. Well, let's start the journey that you take us on through the book, which, as I said, goes many different places and into many different fields of expertise. And what I love that you did was that
some would say.
I love that there's an important moment when you're discussing all of the forces in play. One of those forces is our forces created by the Earth itself. I want to quote from something you say very early in the beginning, because it places things geographically. You write, the rocks containing the metal ores were laid down on the bed of a shallow ancient sea around 800 million years ago. What was happening geologically that set the stage for the whole story you're going to tell? Well,
I mean, this is the sort of the movement of continents and the formation of what we think of as the African continent today. and this splitting, this tearing asunder, and then coming back together around the area that is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and this is known as plate orogeny, or the creation of plates as well. So this is a very, very interesting and significant geological period, because some of these salts that were laid down on the bed of these ancient seas ended up becoming some very, very critical metals that are in use today.
Right, exactly. We hear the terms rare earths often and critical metals. You're talking about critical metals, which can include rare earths. And one of those that is prominent in Congo, as you write about, and others have written about as well, is cobalt. Just very quickly, and then you go into chemistry in the book. Let's talk a little bit about what cobalt is and what's so special about it.
So cobalt is a metal, and it is used in the cathode, which is the positive electrode of lithium-ion batteries, which are the batteries that power your cell phones, your electric cars, your Oura rings, your whatever it is, your earbuds, anything that's used for the small devices, basically anything that doesn't use perhaps a nickel cadmium battery, which are less and less popular, and basically every cell phone uses that battery. And cobalt basically allows the positive electrode to store more energy, to take it into very simple terms. And it allows for a great amount of energy to be packed into a very, very small space.
So we're all walking around carrying cobalt that in all likelihood comes from the Congo.
Yeah, around 70% of the supply of cobalt comes from the DRC.
So to focus then on Congo, you, as you said already in your introduction, you write a great deal about what's happened in Congo, the conditions in Congo. Again, you take us back in history to kind of the how we got there point of view. And one of the more compelling characters that you talk about is the King of Belgium. Tell us about him and why your focus on him in the book in terms of the role he plays in getting us where we are.
Well, Congo has for hundreds of years, even before King Leopold II, been exploited for its resources, both by European and by sort of Arabian and Gulf powers, which are East Coast African slave traders who were taking men out of Congo even before the Belgians arrived. But in 1885, the Conference of Berlin, Leopold II came into the Congo as he came in as basically the proprietor of this giant private property, which was ruthlessly exploited for first ivory and to some extent gold, and then rubber and copper, and copper became more popular and more important as electrification took hold. But it's interesting because you see technology driving quite a lot of the exploitation in the DRC, even from the late 19th century onwards. You have rubber, which is used in bicycle and vehicle tires, and then you have copper, which is used for electrical wire. And then a little bit later, around the time of the Second World War, the uranium used to build the first atomic bomb was actually mined in the south of DRC at a mine called Shinkolobwe. And so cobalt, which is a byproduct of copper, it comes with copper in the heterogenite ore that the south of the DRC is so rich in. That copper is used, cobalt has become very, very important for modern technology. It's also used in other things like cleaning fossil fuels and in alloys that are used in aerospace engines and so on.
So the king actually, it wasn't a nation; it was his private property. It was a giant swath of Africa. Was his personal possession.
Yes, we think what we think of today as a sort of private property, and the Belgian government, people were so brutally treated in the DRC, and this sort of came to the fore in the early 20th century, right in sort of around the 1900s. People like Roger Casement and E.D. Morel wrote these pamphlets explaining exactly what was happening in the DRC, which was that people's hands were getting cut off if they didn't meet their rubber quota. People were being press-ganged into forced labor, their women were being raped, and their children were being taken away and killed in some cases, in many cases. Photography was also a very powerful tool at the time. Lady Ali Seeley Harris, who I mentioned in the book, took this heartbreaking picture of a man named Nsala looking at the severed hands of his wife and child, and it's really very, very upsetting. So I think that resonated with people, and the Parliament of Belgium in 1908 voted to take the property away from King Leopold, but the Belgian colonialists remained very, very exploitative.
So let me and what you do in the book is you draw a line from that heritage of exploitation through to today, where it's a different world in a lot of ways, but the existence of the Congolese people is not anything any of us would want, and it's very much affected by this pursuit of cobalt. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it's affected by the pursuit of raw minerals, and Congo is incredibly wealthy in terms of raw minerals, but it remains one of the poorest places on Earth. And whether it's gold or coltan, which is a metal that's an ore that's used to produce a metal that's also in many of our electronics, or tantalum or tungsten or any of these resources, the DRC is consistently exploited for them. And so cobalt, again, is one among many of these things. But the fact is that it is fairly ubiquitous in electronic devices. And so that was why I sort of focused in on it. But it's also interesting because it's become a geopolitical risk, and the US and China are now sort of duking it out in the DRC, trying to take control of that supply chain.
You describe the lives of artisanal miners, and that's a concept I'm not sure that our audience would have familiarity with. You're incredibly sympathetic to what they're doing, but tell us what it is they're doing, who they are, how they work, and why they're there.
So artisanal miners are people who work in terrible conditions for around $1 a day. And they are, this is many of the artisanal miners that I interviewed. They are essentially working with metal bars and very, very crude tools. Some of them don't even have shoes. They climb down these incredibly deep pits in order to pry ore loose from the rock face, and oftentimes these people are very young. Some of them are even children. Some of them are women, and then beyond miners, there are people who wash the ore. There are people who lug sacks around, and some of these are even pregnant women who are affected by this mildly radioactive ore. You remember I said that some of the atomic bomb material in the first atomic bomb came from that region. So some of the ore in that region is also radioactive, and the Congolese government has an office that deals specially with that. But essentially, these people are working in what has been described as medieval conditions for very, very low wages. And artisanal makes you think of this kind of, somebody making cheeses,
baking bread, yes,
baking bread or something like that. But it is far from a wonderful life.
They're essentially individually freelancers or small groups of people getting together. In other words, it's not a large industrial operation. These are people who are out kind of scratching their own existence out of the earth, digging what they can, and then selling it to middlemen. Is that pretty much accurate?
That's pretty much accurate. Congolese law actually says that they should be part of a collective, but there are lots of people who are working in much, much smaller groups, or even just for themselves.
You tell an amazing story of, I think it's potentially legend, not you don't tell us that it actually happened, but about a man who broke up the floor of his house and began digging down from his house because there was cobalt there, and he wanted people not to know. Is that true? Did that happen?
Well, I spoke to a lot of people who were his neighbors and so on. I think that the story has been repeated so many times that a lot of the details remain unclear or embellished. So, but what we do know is that there was somebody who, in around 2014, started digging into the soft earth around his home in the subdivision of Kasulo, which is a little neighborhood in the town of Kolwezi, and found some ore. And this started a frenzy of digging. And I spoke to his almost his direct neighbor, a guy called Zanga Muteba, who was a baker. So he definitely existed. There's a lot of speculation about how rich this man got and so on, and who he was exactly. Some people say he was a migrant from a different part of Congo. That might be informed by prejudices within the Congolese national makeup, and other people say that he was a policeman. That might be to do with because people don't like policemen. So we don't know that much about him, but what is in the book is as much as I could gather about him.
Fascinating in sort of suggesting the desperation and the appetite and the frenzy that goes on about the rush for people who are in desperate situations, desperate circumstances, to try to dig their way literally out of it. I want to talk about another character in the book, and it's a gentleman named M. Stanley Whittingham. Also, in a very different way, plays a very critical role in this story. Tell us who he is and why he matters.
Well, Stanley Whittingham is a sort of genius-level scientist who comes to America in the late 1960s from the UK and develops a battery for ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil at the time was worried that the world was going to run out of oil, or that there was going to be some serious oil supply issue. And they were thinking about electric vehicles already at that point. And Stanley Whittingham came up with this battery, which remained very experimental. But he figured out that you could move lithium ions from a cathode into an anode and across an electrolyte. And in doing so, you would release electricity. So Whittingham was the kind of pioneer, but then the technology was refined first at Oxford University in a lab of another sort of genius level scientist, this time who came from the US to the UK. So there's this kind of wonderful symmetry to the story. And he realized that if you put cobalt into the cathode, you can make it much more stable and pack it with more lithium ions, essentially. And then you had a development by a Japanese scientist in the 1980s, and he realized that the battery would become even more stable if you created a graphite anode, which is the negative electrode, and he created a battery that wouldn't blow up if you crushed it, and that was really the point that the battery became important, important commercially. That was the point that Sony realized that you could put it into a small camcorder, and then it became very popular in the 1990s. So Whittingham is really the first person who figures out that you can do this with lithium ions, and he had figured it out because he had studied the way that ions react with tungsten on space vehicles and so on. So he'd done a lot of work on ion transfer, which was a field of chemistry that was very important at the time.
So without his discovery and the improvements that his other two colleagues, and I think the trio won a Nobel Prize for this in 2019 for this work. Exactly. But without them, and prior to the 1990s, the idea of a small phone having a battery that would last for hours was technologically impossible, more or less.
Yes, I mean, the nickel-cadmium batteries can provide, some, you remember those old, in the 1980s, those old brick phones. I have a vague memory of them. Those had bigger nickel-cadmium batteries that had a shorter battery life. So that was, it was the technology that allowed the mobile phone revolution that we know today to be possible.
And also to put that cobalt in all of our pockets and all that lithium in all of our pockets.
Yeah.
Another fascinating character you talk about is a Chinese entrepreneur named Wang Chuanfu. Tell us his story, how he fits in.
So Wang is a fascinating character. He grew up very poor in China, and he was someone who basically was again, genius level scientist. Went to study in one of China's most prestigious technology institutes, and then came to Shenzhen in the early 1990s. Looked around and he saw all these people shouting into their mobile phones, and he realized that they needed to be powered. He looked into it, and he realized that these batteries were very important. And he essentially got some money from his cousin, and as a sort of startup investment, and started a factory where people were literally putting these batteries together by hand in a workshop, and this developed quite quickly into a very, very profitable battery business. And then he started focusing in the early 2000s on electric vehicles. This was very much as well supported by the Chinese Communist Party, of which he was a member. And he was, this was very much a priority for the Chinese Communist Party. It had seen battery power for vehicles as an end goal since even the days of Chairman Mao, who had said that every Chinese person should have an electric bicycle, which I go into a little bit in the book. So we see that this was both somebody who worked incredibly hard, an incredibly gifted scientist, but somebody who was very much part of the state structure and very much part of the objectives of Beijing.
You write about a couple of missed opportunities, and one of them is directly in relationship to who's going to have the lead on batteries. Wasn't Japan out front? When you say Sony developed the lithium-ion battery or commercialized the lithium-ion battery for camcorders starting around 1991, that's all well within the memory of most of us. Japan was in front. What happened?
So Japan went through a series of bruising financial negotiations with the U.S. And Japan in the 1980s was the boom, the bubble. This was the center of electronics in the world. And as the 1990s wore on, the Japanese currency became more expensive, and it became more expensive to pay Japanese workers to do things like put together batteries. So they started to outsource first to Korea, and Korea built a powerful battery business, and then later to China, as China became more and more popular as a destination, not just for these kind of homegrown battery shops like BYD, but also for companies like Sony to put their battery factories in and create these things at a very, very low cost compared to what they would be able to do in Japan. These companies were building factories and not really thinking about the consequences. What happened at the time was an incredible amount of intellectual property theft, and Chinese companies suddenly ended up with a great deal of this Japanese technology, this advanced technology.
Stolen from Japan, more or less?
Well, I mean, maybe the Chinese wouldn't say stolen, because there was this one intellectual property case involving Sony and BYD in a specific type of polymer that they were using in a lithium-ion battery. And the Chinese came out and said, no, BYD hasn't stolen this technology. And so this was seen as a kind of sea change. This was in the sort of late 2000s. So basically, this kind of gave companies like BYD, CATL it gave them the prompt that to go out and acquire as much of this technology as they could. And that was also done by acquiring companies like A123, which was a US battery startup that was working with some very innovative ideas around lithium-ion batteries. They went under in Detroit in the mid 2010s, and they were acquired by a Chinese company that had been using the factory had been producing sheets until very recently. So it was very clear that there was some sort of technology transfer going on there, and that's been happening for quite a while in China, as I document in the book as well.
As I say, that we call this conversation "Think Twice" because we like to look at things that we think we know one way, and your book tells us how maybe we have forgotten things that were a different way, and to go back to the 1970s again in the United States and in the Western world in general. As you mentioned, the Chinese were, as government policy, wanted everybody to have an electric bicycle because batteries worked. But in the United States, beginning in the 1970s, we forget there was a focus on batteries and even on electric cars coming out of what was then the nascent environmentalist movement. Take us back to that time and the first time our culture got excited about electric cars and then stopped being excited about them.
Well, so electric cars, our culture was excited about electric cars since the beginning of automobiles. There were some of the first cars ever were electric vehicles, powered by lead-acid batteries in the 19th century. And Henry Ford's wife had an electric car, and there were more electric cars on the road in 1908 than gas-powered cars, because you used to have to crank them, and they could break your arm. Gas-powered cars and electric vehicles were seen as clean and quiet and so on. But of course, oil takes over. Or petrol takes over, and then
we say gasoline takes over in this.
Gasoline takes over. There you go. Then in the 1970s, the Arab-Israeli crisis was certainly was creating issues with the oil prices, and there were all these oil shocks. And OPEC was behaving aggressively and trying to act as a cartel to raise oil, was effectively raising oil prices. And so companies started to look at how to make electric vehicles. Ford was looking at technology to create something called a sodium-ion battery, which is basically a salt-powered battery. You had to keep it molten, so that was completely unpractical to use in a car. Although these days they've figured out how to do a sodium-ion battery, and this is kind of one of the exciting new technologies on the market. But the interesting, it's filled with interesting characters, and to take it to a character, there's this one electric car pioneer, somebody called Bob Aronson, who was really the kind of the father of the electric car in the 1970s in the US, and he had a battery factory in Puerto Rico, where they needed to create these batteries which would do well under very extreme temperature conditions. And he had actually added cobalt to this battery, and he had this what he called a tripolar cobalt battery, tripolar lead cobalt battery, and he had created these cars which would be they would be powered by refueling stations in Holiday Inns across motorways around the Midwest. And this actually existed. So the first network of charging stations and so on wasn't Tesla, wasn't the EVs that we know today, but it was actually Bob Aronson's network of Holiday Inn charging stations across the Midwest in the United States, which was kind of fascinating. But you wanted to ask about how they
how that all went away.
That all went away. Oil, suddenly there was a lot of discovery in the late 1970s. Reagan renewed his focus on oil, and this was seen as pocket change for Exxon at that point. And there was in the 1980s, people turned back to oil, and the oil glut of 1982 was really the moment that the electric vehicle sort of then was winnowed away. And I think it was a change, obviously, from a Democratic administration under Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan's administration that really provided the sea change in the way that people were thinking about they were going to power their future vehicles.
So it wasn't just the high cost of oil, but also the perception of oil as a environmental hazard that excited people in the 70s and the 80s and Bob Aronson about, using electric vehicles instead.
Well, Bob Aronson is interesting. The reason he wanted to build an electric vehicle was because he had been a postboy when he was a teenager, and he was cycling behind all these diesel trucks, and he got the fumes in his face, and he thought, okay, I want to make a car that doesn't emit smoke, or as he called it, a smokeless car.
Smokeless car, yes.
And that was his. He continued trying to do that for the rest of his life, even well into the 2010s.
So now we were back in an era where people are excited about electric cars again, and Elon Musk is somebody we may talk about in a few minutes. But this promise that batteries are going to make for clean. Are going to make for a cleaner environment. Is that a promise fulfilled?
Look, I think that there are many studies that have been done, and they look at the different emissions produced by electric vehicles. They're called Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. If you take all the emissions together and you compare it to a gas-powered car, there is a time horizon before which the gas-powered car is much more environmentally efficient. So you have to hold on to your electric car for more than, the average American, I think, has their car, holds on to their car for 2.5 years. So if you're changing your electric vehicle every 2.5 years, you're doing more environmental damage than you are than having a gas-powered car. Hybrid cars are much more environmentally efficient than something like a Tesla. They're just very, very costly to produce in terms of, the amount of copper that they use, the amount of cobalt, producing the batteries. This is something that obviously changes with the amount of coal or clean energy or natural gas that you have in your power supply system, of course. In China, for example, an electric vehicle is not more environmental than a gas-powered vehicle until 10 years after it's bought.
Why is that the case? Why is that different in China?
Because China produces most of its power using coal.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of blew my mind. I mean, we're given these kind of shiny new cars, and we're told that they're environmental, and in fact, we're producing more harm than if they were just gas-powered cars. Now, that is not to say that electric vehicles cannot be environmental. In fact, if mining was cleaner, if transport was cleaner, if the supply chain was cleaner, all of these things, if more battery refining was done in African countries, for example, or close to the place that the mines were and so on, they would have, in fact, be much, much cleaner. And we know how to do this, but because of laziness, because of greed, because of all these different corruption, all these different factors that we see in the book, we're not doing this. And so the fact is that the supply chain for electric vehicles at the moment creates these externalities. It's not the electric vehicles themselves.
Right. But again, something for us to think twice about. And the assumption that these cars are cleaner overall is you're challenging that thought as things stand now, although you're saying it could get better. I want to bring it back to Africa and to Congo, and another part of the story that you focus on a great deal is there's a kind of great power battle going on, a great game battle going on in Africa between China and other powers, including the United States, where it seems China's winning. And you just used the word corruption. Corruption rips all through your account of how business is done in Congo and includes how it's being done now by China. Paint that picture for us overall, because it's fascinating.
Well, I mean, I think corruption has marked extraction in the DRC since the very beginning, and it's the share structures of the Belgian companies served to obfuscate the ownership of these companies. People say they were Belgian companies, but they were in the way that a modern company might be owned, or a company today might be owned by shareholders in wherever it is. There are many shareholders also in the Anglo-Saxon world. So there's this an obscurity that has been there for a long time, and then since decolonization and the assassination, the killing of the first elected prime minister of the DRC, Patrice Lumumba, the country has shifted into a essentially kleptocratic form of governance that has never really been able to get away from. I mean, you look at the current president, and he has a collection of Patek Philippe gold watches that has flourished since he took power, and I think there's a very, very clear source of that, and I think the source of that is mining revenue, basically.
The longtime leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo, when he insisted on renaming the country Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko, from, I believe, 1971 to 1997, was the epitome of corruption, and a very, very rough player who was abusive to his opponents. You famously tell the story in the book of his treatment of a rival named Pierre Mulele, whom he lured back from exile on a promise of amnesty, and instead he had him publicly castrated and had his eyes gouged out and his limbs cut off. So Mobutu was a very, very rough player, and yet he was one that Western powers were kind of willing to deal with because they wanted the rocks fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean, I think after the killing of Lumumba, who was seen as far too close to the communists, Mobutu was gradually, expanded his power. He wasn't technically in power until 1965, but he basically controlled the government through a CIA-backed conspiracy, which was known as the Binza Group, which operated kind of in the shadows in Kinshasa, and he controlled the army as well as fighting these wars against Marxist separatists in the eastern part of the country. But Mobutu was basically, I mean, I had a CIA officer from the time explain it to me, and he said, look, Larry Devlin, who was a CIA station chief in Kinshasa at the time, was enamored of Mobutu because he found him charismatic and what's more, pro-West. And I think that he was very, very good, and we see this later on because he's very good at shape shifting. He basically, when he was with his Western counterparts, he was able to sort of show himself as a pro-West person, and when he was with his Chinese counterparts, he visited China for the first time in the early 1970s. He was able to sort of shift into a kind of Chinese, into a form that the Chinese would think that they could do business with. So from that time, there was this sense of Congolese leaders trying to play one side against another, and that really has continued to this day. I mean, there's been various different deals that the current president has done, both with China and the U.S., and he's able to be shaking Xi Jinping's hand one year, and then he's shaking President Trump's hand, the next.
Would our listeners want to, be thinking twice about China's role in Africa if they're not aware of it, to understand just how, I think you could say, dominant Chinese influence has become in that part of the world, particularly when it comes to control and extraction of these materials?
Yeah, I mean, China is the most important power, I would say, in many countries in Africa. But they are a commercial power in a way that the U.S. is not, I would say, at this point. they have commercial interests. The US has a lot of military interest in Africa, and I think that if you're an African on the street, you look and you say, we are seeing troops coming out of the US, and we are seeing investment coming out of China, and I've heard that a lot actually. So I think that the difficult thing is to say China has absolute dominance, because they don't, and I don't think they require that. They actually they really don't mind, almost ideologically, where the governments that they're dealing with are. They just mind that they can get the deals done and secure access to the minerals that they want to.
Where did the fire for telling the story come from in you?
I think that's an interesting question. Look, I was focused on different corruption stories. I started writing about migration in the mid-2010s, and I started looking at the conditions that cause migration in Greece, which is where my father is from, and I was doing a lot of work on the island of Samos at one point. And I kept seeing Congolese people coming over, and they said, look, there's nothing for me at home. I can't work at home. I'm leaving home. These are not people fleeing the violence of the east of the country. I mean, some of them were, but many of the people there were saying, look, it's just the conditions of poverty are so crushing that I have to get out. And so I started, and I'd always known Congo as this very, very wealthy country, and I'd read King Leopold's Ghost, but I wasn't aware of I wasn't aware quite how impoverished the country was, despite having all these riches. And I started looking at specific stories of corruption around a specific Congolese mining fixer. I went down to write that story, and I saw, basically children and people without shoes and women digging the materials out of the ground, going to these mines where there were no roads to the mines, and so on and so forth. And just thinking, how is this the place that the green transition can be rooted in? I mean, how can we think of an environmental future if this is the impact on a country, and this is the impact on a country already so impoverished? And then so I just began at that point, really.
A journey of how many years for you working on this book?
I started in 2019, and now it's 2026. So
7 years,
almost 7 years, yeah.
Including you weren't abducted, but you were arrested along the way.
I was detained, I think.
Detained. What happened there?
So I was looking into a persistent rumor about rebel groups and critical metals, and the government, for whatever reason, used that as an excuse to arrest me. But I think it was also to do with the fact that I was looking into ownership by the presidential family of mines, which is technically illegal.
Well, that will get you in trouble if they know about it.
You kick the hornet's nest.
We're going to bring in some other voices now. They've been some experts in the topic who have been listening, and I'm sure have some questions of their own for Nicolas. And first, I'd like to welcome in Tim Butcher. Tim is an award-winning journalist and author. He worked for many years for the Daily Telegraph, and he wrote the book Blood River, which is about the Congo. Joining us today from Cape Town, South Africa. Tim, welcome. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Hi, thanks for having me. I've been very interested in.
I'd love to hear what your question is.
Well, I guess my question to Nicolas is, you're so right to place this within the history of the Congo, a place where any resource has been exploited and any resource has not led to any upliftment for the people of the Congo. What hope is there in this? Is there any hope of that historical cycle being broken in this round? The sad truth is that copper and cobalt are in your book, but the coltan story you mentioned, correctly mentioned earlier on, that claimed 200 lives last week in a mine slip, in a landslide in eastern Congo. So the cycle regenerates. My question to you is, how can that cycle be broken? What hope is there that people like the people you interviewed in the book on the ground can have an improvement in their lives?
Yeah, and thank you very much for that question, Tim, and thank you for engaging with the book so carefully. Look, as I read your book before, which was published in sort of around 2007, right? I read that book before going out to the DRC for the first time, and oftentimes I felt that very little had changed. So that's a short span of time. But then over and again, I was going back to these sort of historical narratives. And once you get out of the cities, I mean, very, very little has changed for people on the ground. And oftentimes things have gotten worse. The same cycles of violence, the same cycles of impoverishment, the same cycles of corruption. So I don't, especially with the current government, I don't think that there is any room for optimism. These deals, these peace deals that have been done with Rwanda, and you're right to highlight the mine slide in Rubaya last week, which was, I mean, if that had happened in Europe, it would have been on everybody's screens for months. I mean, that was an absolutely horrific tragedy. But the problem is that the same mentality of corruption at the top within Congolese leadership, and the same facilitation of that by Western companies and now by the U.S. government in this new critical metals deal, in which they are basically buying rights of Congolese mining. That certainly does not give me much hope. I think what needs to happen is, as I say in my very brief bit at the end of the book, there are some communities like the community of Bunkeya, which is a historic community which is sort of ruled over by a historic king, or a mwami as they're called in Swahili, and he has managed to uniquely agitate for a portion of mining revenues to come back to his town. So it shows that when effort is put into these things, and when there's to some extent, I don't want to say enlightened leadership, but some sort of effort made to actually ameliorate the situation, you are able to do things like construct hospitals, build roads, build schools, and improve people's lives. So I think that there's something to be said for localized efforts, and I highlight, for example, a school called Still I Rise, which is getting children out of the mines and into school, and yes, so there are these very small glimmers of hope, but the larger picture is a picture in which might is right and the richest person wins. So that's pretty upsetting, I find.
I mean, your anecdote about scrabbling down beneath the ground because the coltan is so rich, I mean, that happened in the country I'm in. I mean, South Africa, it's a place, a name you'll know. It's called De Beers. It was a farm called De Beers where people scrabbled down and found some grey soil, and it bore diamonds, kimberlite, diamondiferous kimberlite. It was anarchy. There was death. There was exactly the artisanal chaos that you describe, not the yeast bread, sourdough version of artisanal, but the dystopian one. And yet something happens. So my concern is, and you're right to flag up, 20 odd years ago, I was following a similar narrative. It breaks my heart that a nation, with this extraordinary potential, can't take that leap to we ensure the ground is secure. The hill that was destroyed at De Beers was turned into the largest man-made, hand-dug pit in the world. And yet literally there's a fence around it and there's some sort of structure. And it kind of sounds a bit, there is just one follow-up, if I may, John, sorry, it's a bit greedy, but just going to China and America, there's only one winner here, surely. I think John used the word China is winning. I think, forgive me, we're in the past tense. China has won. It has positioned itself in Africa. It has positioned itself in the Congo. It's positioned itself in Zambia, positioned itself all over, way ahead of the Americans. The Americans it's too slow. Would you accept, is it a past tense, or is there still a chance, Nicolas?
Well, I think that what's very interesting about this recent round of deals is that the government of Felix Tshisekedi has shown that they're willing to abrogate former deals that they've made with China. So I think if I was sitting in Beijing, if I was Xi Jinping and thinking about Tshisekedi, I think you'd be quite upset with him at this point, because this huge $7 billion deal that was done in 2000, that finalized in 2009, and then renegotiated in 2023 by Felix Tshisekedi, is now being kind of put to one side. But I totally agree with you. In many ways, China has won in Africa. Of course, I think that's what the US is trying to undo right now. The question that I have is whether they have the volition and the brain power to actually do this. And when I say brain power, I mean Africa has been so under-resourced within the structures of US diplomacy at the State Department and so on for so many years. And you have a lot of, you have a couple of very dedicated people who are sort of, interested in the right things in Africa and so on within the US, within the State Department. But what has happened is that it's been completely underinvested in, and they haven't really been a voice at the table. So the US is having to pay a huge amount of catch-up. Will they be able to outmaneuver China? That remains to be seen. I think that the odds are against them.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us, and it's great to have your perspective as somebody who's been reporting on this topic for a very, very long time. So thanks for joining us. Next, we'd like to bring in Kamila Domanowski, who covers cars and energy for National Public Radio. Kamila, thanks so much for being with us today. And what question do you have for Nicolas?
Yeah, thank you for having me for this fascinating conversation. I talk to American drivers and car buyers all the time, and there's clearly growing public awareness of the human and environmental costs of these battery supply chains. Dating back years now, I've been hearing about it more and more from drivers, and I'm curious whether the growing public consciousness of these problems seems to be creating any signs of improvement, whether that's major manufacturers pushing for transparency into their own supply chains, or government policy and regulations, or even mining companies trying to self-regulate to avoid a blood diamonds level problem with their reputations, or not.
I'd also like to see if you can answer that question in terms of the phone manufacturers as well, if they have a sort of awareness and consciousness and some, yeah.
So look, Apple is moving towards recycling. They want to have new iPhones. I think they already have some iPhones that are 100% recycled cobalt. Of course, that cobalt came from somewhere in the first place. Of course, car manufacturers want to do the same thing. I mean, I think recycling is the recycling chain has become, companies like Redwood Materials and various other recycling companies in the US and abroad have figured out how to efficiently recycle lithium-ion batteries. So that certainly is happening. But recycling cannot provide the entire supply of batteries that we need. I think that what's very, very interesting is the move towards the lithium iron phosphate technology within the auto industry. This is a different type of cathode which does not use cobalt. It still uses lithium, and it uses phosphates, which are a scarce resource as well, that come from a lot of them come from Morocco, and some of them come from the Western Sahara, which is a disputed territory. So the section on phosphates in my book actually points out that there's no free lunch in terms of battery technology. So in terms of companies self-regulating, we've seen, for example, Tesla locked in their supply chain very early at Glencore's mine, their KCC mine in southern Congo. And in many ways, I mean, Glencore has been involved in some of the scandals around acquisition and so on. This was also quite a few years ago at this point in the DRC. But the mine that they run, and I go into this in the book, is actually very, very, completely up to international standards, and is, when they had a spill a couple of years ago, they went to big lengths to clean it up. But I would say that companies are often too happy to use China as a buffer and to say, look, we don't know where this stuff comes from. It comes from an approved smelter, and that's enough for us. And the supply chain due diligence has been too often cast to one side. So I would say that yes, there has been a little bit of engagement, but you don't really see it on the ground. You only see the mining companies and the Chinese mining companies have not also been very good at this. But you see the few non-Chinese mining companies being a little bit more conscientious and being more in line with international standards. The problem is that governance issues cannot be fixed by companies, or they cannot be fixed by companies alone. And when the US government goes and certifies an election which was obviously fraudulent, you create a situation in which the rule of law is undermined, and in some sense, stealing becomes almost legitimized. So you have to sort of trace it all back to these problems of governance, and that's why the book is shot through with tales of corruption.
Camila, do you have a follow-up?
No, I mean, I thought that was a pretty thorough answer. I am struck by how the opacity of the supply chains, the difficulty of tracing the product that the consumer buys back to the actual origin of the minerals seems like such a fundamental problem here, or very convenient for the companies involved to have cover for nobody being specifically to blame for something that's so pervasive across the entire.
Do you have the sense, though, that the message that it actually is at the core of Nicholas's book, it does have impact on what they're thinking? Are they aware? Are they concerned?
I mean, I will say, speaking as somebody who interviews drivers and car shoppers regularly, that reporting like this, dating back years, has definitely translated into the public. And people struggle with evaluating the relative impacts, right? They know that causes air pollution when they're burning gasoline in their own communities, and it contributes to climate change. And they have thoughts about the impacts, including human impacts of oil extraction. And then there's these supply chains for these batteries. It's absolutely a topic that people are thinking about and weighing in their personal decisions.
I mean, the impact of the electric vehicle, let us not forget, has been to magically fossil fuel cars or gasoline cars have magically become much more fuel efficient in recent years. So I think that might have been a knock-on effect of electric vehicles.
Camila, thank you so much for joining us today with your questions. I really appreciate it. And finally, we have another Tim. Tim Deschamps is a senior climate reporter at TechCrunch. Tim, thanks for joining us. We're delighted to have you with us, and I know you've been listening to the conversation, so please jump in.
Yeah, thank you, John. And Nicholas, earlier you mentioned the environmental impacts of today's electric vehicles. And I think you're absolutely right to call it out, but of course, it's not exactly true that gas-powered cars are more environmentally friendly. You know, when people buy a new car, they don't junk the old one after 2.5 years. Somebody else buys them. And the climate impact tends to break even around 10,000 to 25,000 miles, depending on whether you're talking about pure internal combustion or hybrid power. And since automakers plan for 20-year lifespans, the difference widens, of course, over that tail end. Now, that's not to say that automakers are off the hook if they only switch to EVs, because it's clear that probably does need to happen if we're going to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. But, you know, the vast majority of batteries come from China, and Chinese companies, and China itself has been laying the groundwork for this for the past 30 years. What can anybody outside the Communist Party do at this point?
What could anybody outside the Communist Party do? I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. I think that certainly the U.S. government is trying to change things. They're trying to find people to mine and refine these materials. I think there are very few of them, and I mean, I think it's very telling that the company that has just announced it's going to buy a 40% stake in Glencore is a company that has only existed since October. So I think that's certainly very telling, but not in Glencore, but in Glencore's mines in the DRC. Forgive me, DRC track mined here. But yes, I think you're right that of course electric vehicles are not pulped the moment after they're sold. But I think there's also a feeling that obviously more consumption leads to more production as well.
I mean, that's true. I think it's just it's challenging here. And I think we're seeing a lot of whiplash between changes in governments in the U.S. and having a hard time maintaining a consistent industrial policy. Whereas, not to say China hasn't had changes in industrial policy over the last 30 years, but they've been pretty laser focused on extracting minerals from from DRC and from Greater Africa in that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I had a conversation with a former Great Lakes envoy, Tom Perriello, a former congressman as well, for this book, and he just said, look, the U.S. cannot, in the same way that China does, set industrial policy and focus so much on creating electric vehicles and building batteries and so on. It's just a totally different style of government. But the Chinese way of doing things, of course, has a lot of casualties, and it's to a large extent very wasteful. So there are benefits as well to the way the system operates in the U.S. I think the difficult thing is shifting an economy that has moved away from manufacturing back toward manufacturing and this kind of and back towards refining and things like that. Stuff that was not very popular for many years is very difficult, and it requires a huge amount of investment. And the question is, who is going to provide that investment?
All right, Tim, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We just have a few minutes left, Nicolas. I'm curious. There are potential fixes to batteries that would make them more sustainable using different materials, different minerals, different rocks fundamentally. But are you concerned that switching away from, if it were even possible, cobalt or finding alternatives would still lead to the same regime of exploitation and corruption?
Well, I mean, history has shown us that if the modern world wants something, Congo has it. So weirdly enough, just seems to be over and over again this is happening. And let's not forget that electric vehicles have huge amounts of copper. I forget how much more copper but several times more copper than a usual car. And copper is very, very abundant in the southern DRC. So it's not as if Congo will be left behind anytime soon in terms of what people want from it. But yes, I think you're right in terms of the amount of materials you're right in terms of different developments will have different knock-on effects on different parts of the world. Sodium-ion batteries can use salt water to produce. Can use salt and salt water to produce power. Yet, for example, one of those technologies, the Prussian blue technology, does produce very toxic byproducts, and the creation of it also has some unfortunate and quite nasty environmental side effects. So I don't think there's any free lunch, and I think it's to do. I think the real answer is to slow down consumption and to slow down the speed of life. In the book, I quote briefly the Austrian social theorist Ivan Illich, who wrote in the 1970s, and he focused on energy. And he said, high speed is one of the problems of modern society. It creates problems environmentally, and it creates problems socially. And in many ways, that's what we're seeing. We see both the social and environmental impacts of our lust for devices and for speedy electric vehicles.
And it sounds from everything you're saying that actually making definitive statements about the environmental impact of one option or the other is a risky game, that it's so complex that we may not actually be able to say definitively what's more harmful or not. Am I right about that?
I mean, I think that's right. I wouldn't go quite so far. I would say, look, we know how to produce electric cars. We know how to produce batteries, and they should be environmentally friendly. They should be much greener than fossil fuel vehicles, but they're not. And the reason is the supply chain. And so I guess the thing that I would say is, rather than jumping at the next new magic technology or jumping at magic technology in general, first sort out the supply chain. In order to be environmentally minded, first sort out the supply chain, and then move towards the technology and to mass adoption of the technology, rather than building the ship backwards or building the plane as you're flying it, I guess.
I don't have any sense that there's a technological solution to the abusive conditions that the Congolese miners are working in, and the Congolese people in general, and the corruption. That's not about the technology, is it?
Well, it's certainly not about changing from cobalt technology to another technology. It's about insisting on governance. It's about making sure that the revenues from mining go towards, trickle down to, don't just trickle down to people, but actually go into government programs to build roads and to build schools and to foster agriculture. I mean, it's a very, very fertile part of the world, and yet it has almost zero agriculture. I mean, it's economic policy that's important on that front, and human rights policy.
I want to wrap up just by circling back to the theme I established at the beginning, where we like to talk about things that make you think twice, and I think that your book, with the many different lenses you brought to the issue of how these devices that are so integral to our own lives in ways that we don't even think about. You've made it clear that you don't think we phone users need to feel implicated in all of the suffering and the corruption and the abuse. But how do you think we need to think twice about our part in this whole economic process of buying and using these phones?
Well, I think recycling your phone is an important thing to do, or recycling your power banks, or whatever device that you have. You can do it in dedicated recycling spots. You should do it because they can burst into flames if they're recycled incorrectly as well, or they're crushed up in garbage trucks and what have you. But look, as a consumer, I think that you have to think about yourself more as like a political actor. I mean, in the US, you can write to your congressman, you can show that you're concerned with this issue. And I think that also insisting upon, supply chain transparency. In the European Union, there's going to be this thing called a battery passport, which is going to be introduced late this year or beginning of next year. And that will trace the supply chain for batteries. But the question is, are those battery passports actually, who controls the information going into them? So it's very, very difficult as a consumer to actually understand what's real and what's not. It was very difficult as a journalist to understand what's real and what's not. But I think it's, the responsibility of all of us to educate ourselves on these topics and to try and insist when one can, and that might be buying a phone that has, certified child labor-free batteries or whatever it is, and not just buying the cheapest option. I think but the consumers, it's very, very difficult to imagine what consumers can do beyond educating themselves on this topic and then, taking their voices to companies.
That's what your book is there for. And the book is called The Elements of Power, A Story of War, Technology, and the Dirtiest Supply Chain on Earth. Nicolas Niarchos, thanks so much for joining us today on Think Twice from Open to Debate.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great being on.
And thank you, Tim and Camila and Tim, for bringing your excellent questions to the table. And a big thank you to you, our audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. As a nonprofit that works to combat extreme polarization through civil discourse, our work is made possible by listeners like you, by the Rosencrantz Foundation, and by supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman. Our CEO is Leah Mathau. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our chief advancement officer. Andrew Lipson is head of production. Michelle Debrasini is head of marketing. This episode was produced by Alexis Pangrazi and Katie Perry. The Open to Debate team also includes Gabrielle Iannicelli, Linda Lee, Gabriella Mayer, and Julia Sirkin. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement. I'm John Donvan. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.